What's cooler than being cool? This podcast. Join us on Cool, 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 a podcast that explores the intersection of inspiring technology, fascinating people, and captivating stories, or a combination of all three. We're going to embrace our inner cool kid today and go behind the scenes with today's innovators and storytellers. I'm your host, Cameron Kitt, founder and CEO of Yo-Yo's, a documentary storytelling company, and today we have the privilege of chatting with Clint Harper. Clint is an air mobility maestro and has been navigating the skies and cityscapes for 25 years. From his dynamic days in the Air Force, managing everything from aircraft dispatch to UAV operations, Clint's journey has been nothing short of action-packed. I would call it blockbuster, but we'll see how close that is to the truth. Now you have a master's degree in city and metropolitan planning and an eye for urban design. You're on a mission to integrate advanced air mobility, which for those listening means flying cars, into our cities. Picture this: flying cars, drone taxis, drone delivery, a future where they're what I call future mobility, and your commute involves more airspace than highway. So, Clint, I just want to say thanks for coming on the show.
No, it's my pleasure. Looking forward to the conversation.
I mean, there's just so much to say about this, but the more I dive into this world, which I wish we didn't call UAM and AAM and eVTOL, those kinds of things, I think those get confusing for the public, but there's so much excitement around how like the world could look, and how I'm now so where I am in my office, I look out the window and I see my car. I have a totally different relationship with how I think of my car now. I see it as like a waste of space, like I use it 4% of the week. So,
yeah.
where do you live, by the way?
I am in just outside of Ogden, Utah, in a city called West Haven. It's a smaller community.
So you're not feeling the hustle and bustle that I'm feeling here in Brooklyn. I can definitely be pretty excited about urban air mobility and all that it has to offer. So first, I just want to start off talking about the Air Force and its relationship to your journey. Can you share some more pivotal moments, experiences from your career that kind of shaped your perspective on aviation?
Yeah, the Air Force really made me who I am today. So going back a little bit before the Air Force, I graduated high school barely. I had a 1.7 GPA. I was pushed out the door. I think they maybe pencil whipped, a few requirements just to get me going, so that I didn't make their record look bad.
Wow.
So it didn't do myself very many favors. Of course, as a young and not a smart kid, I thought I had it all figured out. I was gonna do big things, make a lot of money, so on and so forth, but just didn't set myself up for any of that kind of future. And so I ended up working through a few construction jobs, tried to be a fire alarm salesperson, clean carpets, a bunch of really uninspiring jobs. And I'm grateful that I had a moment of inspiration and a moment of clarity, where I realized that, hey, I didn't do myself any favors by not putting any effort into school, and didn't do myself any favors by just kind of my journey up until that point. And so what that moment of clarity led me to was going to the recruiter's office. I come from a military family. Had been pressured up until that point to join the military, but resisted it, but kind of figured that was the best way to turn things around. And I am so grateful that I made that decision. So grateful that I decided, to go with the Air Force. My original intent was to be a firefighter. I had talked to some people and was going to be a firefighter at the local reserve unit here at Hill Air Force Base. But as we went through the process, I learned that firefighting actually has vision requirements, and you can't tell now, but I have very poor eyesight, and have some pretty strong glasses and contact lens to correct for that. And so I was disqualified from the firefighting career field. And what was left was, out of what was left, I chose aircraft maintenance initially. And so I spent the first 6 years working avionics on AC-130 gunships, which is a communication, navigation, sensor, targeting systems, things of that nature. And then decided to make a change, take advantage of a program that the Air Force has after your first enlistment to retrain into something different, which was airfield management and airport operations, which is really what set me up for what I do now, in terms of understanding how operations take place, most importantly, understanding safe operations take place. And something that was frustrating throughout my career was I thought that airfield management would lead me to a large airport job, Salt Lake City International, doing that kind of thing. And in order to lead myself there, I thought that I was going to have to be working airfields that supported similar aircraft. And I kept getting stuck with these helicopters and UAVs and short takeoff and landing aircraft. And in the Air Force, that's C-17s and C-130s. Different than what we're talking about today within advanced air mobility, but the concept of short takeoff and landing is still the same. And, so I kept getting these non-traditional, unconventional, airframes, operations, missions, that I was supporting, and found myself continually frustrated, that I didn't think that it was taking me where I thought my life was going. But again, looking back
Well,
on
that's
it,
the thing. We make plans and God laughs. Like your life goes a different direction than you think.
yeah.
I just want to pause you there for a second. So 1.7, were you like a cool, this is like the cool podcast. Were you a cool kid, Clint? Were you too cool for school back in the day?
I think if you went back and talked to people that I went to school with, you would struggle to find somebody that would consider me a cool kid. It's you know, cool. In my mind, the cool is like a popularity contest, and so that's
Mm,
the preppy kids, the class presidents, those type of people. But if I go back and look at, I had a lot of friends in different niches, different cliques, so I hung out with the skaters, the cowboys, the metalheads, the
yeah.
goody goodies. I had friends in all those groups. I played hockey. I had a Letterman's jacket, so there's a lot of boxes that I would check, but I was never considered cool.
Yeah, it's interesting because like you think like what you said, you talk about like popular kids, but when I think of like the idea of cool, right? What we're thinking about with the podcast and this tech and what you're working in now, it's always more like cutting edge, like who's on the edge, who's what's happening more on the fringe, and so
Mm.
it's like those are opposites. So yeah, you had a moment of clarity. You got into aircraft maintenance, and then you decided to say, I want to try something else, and you said airfield management, which might not seem like the sexiest set of words, but I looked at your LinkedIn. I mean, you're talking about the future of the way that cities imagine how they're integrating these. You had made this post about this idea of like emergency situation hubs, and like I watch a lot of architecture YouTube about like how cities could and have been designed. I just think that stuff's so interesting. Um, What's the future of airfields and cities, and like what do you think people don't know about the intersection of these things?
Well, when you look at the future, depending on the time horizon you're looking at, I think the sky really is the limit. And so it gets fun in picturing what an aviation enabled future looks like. But where I try and focus my attention on, because in order to get to the future, we have to take that next step. And so we can talk about a future where we have more aircraft in the air than we do vehicles on the ground and things of that nature. I don't know that I agree with that future, but that's the beauty of this. We all have our own ideas of what ideal looks like, but where I've managed to leverage my experience and lessons learned in life is, how do we get to that next step? What does tomorrow look like when we're working towards advanced air mobility and bringing advanced air mobility to reality? What does next year look like? And a lot of times it's not as sexy as is what 50 years, from now looks like, but taking those steps is important, and understanding
Yes.
how we evolve pragmatically and give us time and space to learn from the lessons that we're learning, from each day is important.
So is the most direct next step isolating like flat spaces on top of buildings that we can transform into like helipad landing pads and charging pads, or is it actually like building new spaces?
Yeah, so let me give you. So we've thought about this extensively, and I got my start in this in Utah. And as I'm sure you can imagine, Utah is not on any of the OEMs, aircraft manufacturers, initial launch cities or places where they want to operate first. And so we recognized that and said, all right, well, let's see all the different ways that we can think about this. And so we looked at it from that perspective. The Uber white paper that came out in 2016, envisioned parking garage vertiports in the middle of cities, rooftop vertiports on skyscrapers and high rises and things of that nature. What concerned me about that initially is that when you look at land use planning and zoning and city planning processes and things of that nature, all of that involves public processes, that makes it difficult to change, and difficult to evolve in that. And so that's initially what highlighted my efforts on the community integration, outreach, and education. The things that you talked about at the beginning of this podcast. But then that also took me to, all right, well, what are the other options that we can explore? If the primary, I guess, value prospect of advanced air mobility is bringing aviation and its infrastructure into destination rich areas, what's the inverse of that? Let's look at the existing infrastructure, and is there an opportunity to develop destinations around that existing infrastructure or near that existing infrastructure? And so that led us to look at, how do we activate the existing airports that we have? And we talked to OEMs and early on, and none of them really at the time thought it was a good idea to operate from airports, because airports are
Ah,
typically out further away from the cities. They're not close to the destinations.
well, but
But
that's where you're most likely the use case for these air taxis is get from Manhattan to LGA or get from Manhattan to JFK. I live somewhat close to LaGuardia. That makes a lot of sense, right? That's like one of the like public use cases that's presented is like speed, like part of your travel journey, right? That's really interesting. I hadn't even thought of that because they do have a lot of space out there, at least comparatively,
yeah,
in
well, a lot of
Queens.
airports have. Some airports are very congested and encroached upon, and it's going to be challenging. But there's a lot of airports out there that do have some space to where the cities and the regions can look at that and say, all right, well, if these airports are going to get busier with different types of travelers serving different needs, how can we develop the land close to that in a way that protects the airport, but also makes it more viable as a multimodal piece of infrastructure? And I think that opens a lot more doors, and broadens, the possibility of what we can do with this technology than just looking at the city centers and kind of narrowing in on that. And that is an important piece of this puzzle, but it's not the only piece of the puzzle that we should be
Yeah.
focusing on.
One of the best use cases for this technology that I've seen is there's a company called Jump Arrow, and they're not the only one. There's another company called Horizon that are exploring EMS, like
Yeah.
bringing using eVTOL and the style of aircraft to get EMS people to the scene of a crash, like within 8 minutes, or like instead of 15, right? Or like the stabilize, getting people to the air, getting people to the hospital. Those are the kinds of things where it's like you can't even argue with that. The technology is going to make it.
Yeah.
But when I was talking to Carl of Jump Arrow, he's like, yeah, the biggest use case is these really rural areas where it could be, especially like indigenous land in the middle of Kansas where the roads are terrible. Like there's situations where this kind of technology would have the best application in quickly accelerating people in rural areas where you can overcome a lot of the issues. Like traffic is one thing, and then like literal time to destination in backcountry roads is another thing. So yeah, this
Yeah.
whole idea of like the world that like your career transition to Air Force and the city planning and now what you're doing is really interesting. I like to ask people like, what's the big plot twist that you've had since I'm a filmmaker in your career so far, and how have you overcome it?
Oh wow, I've had many plot twists. Like I said, yeah, each phase of my life, I've always thought about, or I guess had an idea of where my career was going, and it's changed, so often. So maybe the biggest plot twist is that from my Air Force experience, I retired from the Air Force in 2014 and thought that I was going, to that airport job, an airport planner, airport operations, something of that nature. What Again, following I guess the precedent from my high school career, I didn't set myself up great for that transition. I didn't get a degree while I was in the Air Force. Had all the experience, all this experience of running these dynamic operations, but I couldn't get my foot in the door because I didn't have a piece of paper that said I completed some school to go along with it, which was very frustrating. But
It's so
it was a
weird.
blessing in disguise. It forced me to
Yeah.
use my GI Bill. I returned to school. I thought, people told me you just need the piece of paper. And so I thought, do something interesting, do something that interests me. And I've always been interested in community development, city architecture. When I was traveling in the Air Force, I always wondered what makes a place like Rota, Spain, so awesome and enjoyable to be in versus like
Mm.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And no offense to the
I'll
people in
tell you,
Harrisburg, but
it's cars, man. That's the problem.
well, yeah, and
One of them's
that's
designed for cars, the other one's designed for humans.
you're spot on. But I didn't know that if I hadn't gone through the city planning program. And as I was going through this program, I was learning. My undergraduate was in a program called urban ecology, and it's not ecology from the strictly ecological science, biological sense. It's more of a systems perspective of it. And so we looked at primarily unintended consequences of past planning decisions, with a big focus on building cities for cars and not people. And so we looked at, all right, when we decided to put all our eggs in the personal automobile basket, what are the unintended consequences that came from that? Well, we got a whole litany of unintended consequences to include, um, obesity, to include, economic disparities. I mean, the list goes on. It sounds like you're well aware, of all that.
I'm
And
not. I'm
so,
not. I'm not. That's so interesting, right? Like all the stuff that you don't think is related. You
right.
know.
Yeah. And that's, and you look at I guess, the things that you don't necessarily think about. So I loved aviation. Aviation changed my life. It gave me, a whole new perspective on what I was personally capable of, and boosted my self confidence. And so aviation, I had a special place in my heart. And I found myself looking at the unintended consequences of aviation, particularly to disadvantaged communities and people that had to deal with or the negative externalities associated with aviation, noise, emissions, and all that kind of stuff, but didn't have direct access to the benefits. And so it seemed very lopsided. And as I continued to learn about all this, I started getting bitter at aviation. And it got to the point to where I wanted to leave aviation. I didn't want to be in aviation anymore because I thought it was part of the problem.
Hmm.
And I started seeking other areas, which is how I got into some of the urban design stuff. I got that graduate certificate. I went to culinary school. I was thinking any kind of way out of aviation, to do something that was going to benefit communities, do something to help people. And if it wasn't for one of my professors, Keith Bartholomew at the University of Utah, he had heard, I guess, where my mind was going, and he pulled me into his office, and he asked me about it, and I explained to him, what I just explained to you. And he's like, "Well, listen, you can look at this and say I want to run away from these problems, but aviation isn't going anywhere, and so have you thought about staying in aviation and working to bring resolution to those concerns that you shared from within, using your experience, using the position that you've built and all that kind of stuff to make change from within?" And that kind of, it wasn't like a light bulb that went off immediately, but it planted a seed that started turning things around slowly. And so I still was going down this track of leaving aviation. I was focused on transportation planning, urban design, food sustainability, which feeds into some of my interest today within aviation. And I kept going down that track, but I started slowly getting ideas of how aviation might be a part of the solution to some of the issues that we were solving,
That's
or
so
we're seeing.
interesting. Yeah, you were looking at. I remember hearing this. That, like, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard 80% of the world's population has never flown in a plane. Have you heard that?
I've heard
Like,
a similar statistic. It is something
yeah.
significant like that. Yeah.
As like an American, that's kind of mind-boggling because, like, at least the way I was raised, like, the culture is like lifestyle is all about travel. Like your experience of life is about traveling, and that's like how you kind of judge a life well lived, right? And so
Yeah.
it made me think like, oh yeah, there's like what you just mentioned. The poorer communities around the world are getting the raw end of the stick when you said noise and the climate change caused by emissions and stuff. It's easy to want to drop out. So it's interesting that you had that change of heart that he said that to you. Um, what led you to start Harper 4D? Then tell me about that.
Well, I'd gone through a bunch of jobs that, I'm very, very grateful for all the opportunities I had. So I, was an airport system planner for the state of Utah at Utah Aeronautics. That led to an opportunity to serve the city of Los Angeles as their advanced air mobility fellow. It added a whole nother layer of things to my toolbox. I actually had a short stint working with the ATMX team at NASA. And as I was just kind of trying to find, what is my right position in this place, it made more and more sense to try and make that way for myself versus waiting for somebody else to pave that path for me. And then as I went down that direction and thinking of things that I wanted to accomplish in life, not just with my professional career, but me as a father and as a husband, I know my daughters, they're very much, in the same frame of mind that I was in when I was their age, and they, don't care for school. It's not for them. Like they're more hands-on type of people, and so they don't want to learn life through books and through, in a classroom. They want to get out there and experience things. And that's what the Air Force did for me. But for a lot of people and young people like that, the military is one of the very few options available to them that were, they have the opportunity to go in and learn through experience and learn through like more tactile, type of learning. And I thought, well, if I start my own company, I can develop opportunities for my daughters to have that hands-on experience where they don't have to go directly to school and they don't have to have that in order to be successful. I can, you know, build those opportunities for them to learn about aviation, to get involved and start a resume that, looks good, for when they're ready to really jump out into the real world, on all this kind of stuff.
Wow. So really born out of thinking about your daughters and what their life could be like and other
And that's
young
what 4D
folks.
is. I mean, that's what the start of 4D is. 4D, I got 4 daughters, and 4D is
Four daughters. Oh, I thought it was 4 dimensions. Okay.
it is too,
Harper, four
so
daughters. I love that. And it's also for your daughters, right? So four
right,
daughters for your
exactly.
daughters.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Going to take a quick ad break here. This podcast is brought to you by Yo-Yos. You Own Your Own Stories, a documentary storytelling company that demystifies cutting edge technology with human stories. Got a cool story to share? We can help you get it out there. So, yeah, I mean, Clint, speaking of like the ad break, my interest in this is coming from trying to get the public more aware and what a lot of the big companies do, the Jobies and Whisks and whatnot of the world. They do these air shows and people come to them. But if we're being completely honest, public awareness of AAM, which it's like, oh, it hurts me every time I say it, man. Public awareness of flying cars and this technology is like zero. It's as close to
Yeah.
zero. I mean, like the only people who know about it are people who are already interested. How are we gonna like my ideas are all coming from the film industry, right? I'm like, okay, we need Michael Bay putting these in his next movie. We need Fast and Furious to have them having like a race in these electric vehicles, and like we need to like we've had some movies showing like drone delivery, but besides film, what is it going to take to get public awareness and interest and excitement? You talk about community building. Like, if you could wave a magic wand, what's the thing that you would do?
Education, and I love, the filmmaking, angle on this. And so when I was, all those things I told you about that I was exploring to try and get out of aviation, of the things that I was looking at that I didn't actually go down that path was documentary filmmaking, because I thought that would be a really cool, thing, because it's
Notoriously lucrative career in documentary film. No, but that's true. It's interesting, right? Like they do have an impact on making social movements, right?
yeah, and
So
impactful. That's exactly where I was getting at. It's impactful. But education, I think is the key thing, and an honest education. So there's a lot of hype out there, around all this, and it is very much forward looking. And I love, I listened to the podcast with Gary, from Wisconsin here, which was awesome, and I think he had a lot of great points, and I love, admire him a lot. But honest and just frank education, first about aviation, and then about how we're changing aviation into the future. And so, and one of the things that I try and get to is, we always talk about aviation safety record, and that's something that's amazing, but, and I always look at, all right, well, what is the response going to be? Who's going to pick at this, and what are they going to find to have a counter argument? And so I always go down that path. And the counter argument of that is, well, what we're championing with aviation safety is Part 121 operations, which is airline operations. That is the most, it has the most oversight. It's the most, rigorously regulated, segment of aviation, and it includes the aircraft, the operations, the airspace, the infrastructure, the airports. All of that is included, to make that the safest, way of traveling out there. But these aircraft won't be operating under Part 121. They're going to be operating under Part 135, which is more of commuter charter operations, which has a different, not as safe, record. And but there's a lot of things that we can do to continue to get, that safe. And so those are the things that I'm trying to promote and get out there and, get ahead of the arguments, on all this. And so if we go out there and say, hey, aviation is the safest mode of transportation out there, the counter arguments that come back is, well, I did some research and found out that Part 135 isn't as safe. Well, here's the things that we're doing: safety management systems, more robust inspections and oversight, and at the state level, city level, the operators are doing X, Y, and Z. The aircraft are better. I mean, we have a story to tell, as this evolves. And so that's just one example of, I guess, the areas of education that I think
yeah,
is needed.
the initial response that the public has is emotional, not factual, though, right? Like the emotion is, I'm scared. Like I'm scared, so I want to look for reasons why this could be less safe, even though aviation is far and away the safest way to travel. Like it's safer than being a pedestrian in New York. Do you know what I mean? Like getting on a plane because of all the safety regulations. But nobody that doesn't matter logically to the brain. Like when I tell people, oh, the flying cars are coming, everyone I talk to says some variation of like, oh hell no, I'd never get in that. And like, yeah, so that's the answer. Is like, how do you have an argument to an emotional response saying like, here's what we're doing, here's what we're doing. So what I'm hearing from you is we need to have those things prepared and not be caught off guard. Be like, oh well, like I think, how do you make somebody? For me, the comparisons help. Like, when you look at how much more likely you are to die in a car crash, etc. That's always been more useful to me. But at the end of the day, I think it's just trust and exposure. Like people will trust it when they see it, and so that's the hard part. It's like they won't. How do you get over that hump?
Yeah, yeah, and my experience in all this on that emotional side of the response isn't necessarily the safety aspect. It's the inequities, that are born from
Mm,
aviation. The
mm,
fact that it's noisy. When I started doing my work in Utah, before the advanced air mobility movement really started kicking off, I would go out and ask communities, what do you think about your local airport? And many times the reaction, was, had some disgust behind it, and it was basically like, it can go away for all I care because it's just a playground for the rich and the wealthy. I don't have access to it, yet I have to hear the noise. I have to deal with the pollution. I have, and so it's
mm-hmm,
just this, injustice that, that they perceive from that. And so that was something that I was, all right, well, if we're going to make airports more viable and, more contributing, pieces of infrastructure within a community, how do we change the dialogue around that? And so
mm-hmm,
we launched an economic impact study and found out that, hey, it's not just a playground for the rich and wealthy, it's also an anchor for many jobs within the community. And those jobs employ people that create more jobs, so there's secondary and tertiary effects. And so, we can go out to a small community like Manti Ephraim, and I don't know the exact number, but we can say, hey, this airport generates $15 million in annual economic activity because of the jobs that are anchored there. And then that starts changing the dialogue. All right, well, we don't want to lose that economic activity. We don't want to lose those jobs. And then we also hear other emotional responses that people don't connect that with aviation as being a possible solution. And so some of these small communities, we said, what are your big concerns? Well, our biggest concern is that all our children are leaving. They're going to the cities for the job, and they're taking our grandchildren with them. And
mm-hmm,
our community is dying because of it. And so, all
mm-hmm.
right, well, what if we can connect those jobs to the city with a new mode of transportation?
Yeah,
And then all of a sudden that light comes on, and now that disgust turns to hope. Really, is this
yeah,
possible? Can we do this? What do we need to do to make it happen? And it starts getting those ideas, going. It's can those exciting jobs such as working on electric motors or electronics, avionics, and stuff that I got started in, can those be brought to your airport? Because now we have these operations going. Your kids can get a job working in electronics, on aircraft or computer programming for some of this stuff, or as dispatchers, or as any of the number of jobs that I had in there in the local community. Can we create those local for you? And so then the dialogue starts changing, but you still got the people that will come back and say, whatever, I don't like it still. All right,
people
well,
don't like
now we can look
change.
at, yeah, people don't like change, and there's layers of like you said, there's layers of what is really the root of the issue.
Yeah,
And so the next thing that we found was resiliency. Aviation is an important piece of community resiliency. When an earthquake happened in northern Utah back in 2020, we had to shut down everything, rail lines, bridges. We weren't sure what was still going to be safe and what wasn't going to be safe. And while they were doing that and doing their inspections and trying to figure out if the ground infrastructure was still safe, I was communicating with the airports, and within an hour, all the airports were reporting back, "Hey, we're good to go. We're ready."
yeah,
C-17, C-130 helicopter wants to bring in supplies. Just
yeah,
let us know. We can coordinate and make that happen. And so you go out to other communities and say, "All right, well, there's a wildfire happening near you. This airport is now capable of serving as a base for firefighting operations or
yeah,
disaster relief or whatever." And now you got another segment of people that come in and say, all right, well, we don't want to lose that point of resiliency within our community. And there's a lot of people that'll say, I still don't like aviation because of that emotional,
yeah,
that emotional conditioning that I've had to not like aviation. But I like the resiliency. I like the jobs. I like the economic impact. I like the potential for future transportation, but I don't like aviation just because
yeah.
I've been emotionally attached to not liking aviation for so long. And it's so you're You're turning the
There's
tide, you know,
there's
basically.
some people you can't win over, right? It's like crossing the chasm. There's the early majority, or and then late majority. Just an aside to that. I'm from Virginia Beach, where there's a pretty big naval base and Air Force base is a little bit further up, where the most common bumper sticker growing up said "I love jet noise." So like it was like a cultural way of
Yeah,
like, because you heard it a lot, right? We were hearing jets all the time, so like culturally there was like a way, it was like forcing people to embrace it, which was interesting because most of the time, yeah, that response. What It's really interesting to hear what you say about like how you've helped turn the tide on the inequity conversation to be about community resiliency and the impact economically. There's so many local and small airfields that I think a lot of people don't think about. But the thing you said that's really interesting is about how you can like keep people from moving to cities and like maintain certain rural and semi-rural areas, right? This idea of like if I live an hour, like in Virginia, like places like Fredericksburg that are like an hour to an hour and a half from DC, people move in all the time. But if you have an AAM, a flying car solution to get to work, and it's like what 9 minutes or 15 minutes, right, to and from DC, traffic's one of the worst in the world. I don't know if you've ever been there. Um, yeah, that changes your ability to work from certain places. And what you also said is like it's building jobs, and these are green jobs, right? Like we're building a more sustainable future. Ideally, a lot of these are electric and powered other ways potentially, but electric is a big move
yeah,
right
yeah,
now, hybrid and electric and all these steps. So that's really interesting. It's like I'm so glad I'm talking to you because it's such a different conversation than what I normally have in this space. What we're normally talking about is like sustainability, whatever. It's like that word, I don't even know what that means anymore, but like economic resiliency, that's kind of like a new flavor. So I really appreciate that perspective.
I appreciate that you appreciate it.
All right. So, all right. I don't know if you're a gambler, but I want to make a bet with you, Clinder. I want to ask you, like, what's your most outlandish prediction you have about the future, close or far, that you think that like almost no one else agrees with you on?
Ooh, that is. I think that aviation is going to start intersecting industries that we can't even imagine aviation having an intersection with today. And so I'm thinking of like marine uses. The thing that I asked, like when I first started out with this, I looked at the tough challenges, and so like if I wanted to solve the homeless problem or the housing crisis, I would ask people, how does aviation solve the housing crisis or the homeless problem? And I don't have the answer, I don't know the answer, but I also know that we can't get an answer until we ask the question and start getting people talking about it. And if you do that, eventually you start getting ideas that actually might be implementable. It might be feasible. It might be worth exploring. And so I think as we start getting into asking more questions about what can aviation serve with advanced air mobility technology, you know, and start asking those hard questions. Food sustainability. Uh, you know, what's the word I'm thinking of? So there's a one of the things that's inspiring to me, in my career has been in watching indigenous chefs. I'm a Native American, and watching indigenous chef use, culinary skills to reintroduce culture using local foods, and using that as a tool to re-educate on culture, tradition, and all that kind of stuff, was very inspiring to me. And so I've asked, how does aviation support that? How does
Hmm.
aviation create, a local food system, so we can
Hmm.
move, food, goods, and items around. The fact that,
Mm-hmm.
when I get a package of hamburger, that, pieces of that hamburger may have come from Brazil, it may have come from the Midwest, it may have come from Japan, all smashed into one package of ground beef is kind of nuts. Why can't it
Ew.
come from why can't it come from the farm down the road?
Oh, it should.
So
It should come from the farm down
yeah.
the road. That's how it's supposed to be. Yeah,
And
that's
so
so
building local
interesting.
food systems is something, that I think that it could be possible. And so I think it's outlandish, and I say aviation is going to robust local food systems.
Nah,
It may
that's
be
not
outlandish
crazy.
because people aren't talking about it yet. And so let's start that conversation. How do
It's
we do that?
it's just like creative. If you ask the question, here's the thing about humans, we're extremely creative. And so we do figure stuff out if we have the option or the constraint. But I've been talking to a company called Ampere that does hybrid electric, and they work a lot with like pond hopper flights in communities that are like northern Alaska or Hawaii or the Orkney Islands, places like that where literally you get on a plane sometimes just for you and your team to go to a soccer game. Like that's like sometimes that's the only way to get there. And so what I've been talking about with Kevin Nordiker, he's the CEO, is like literally like connecting local business people like fisheries and food to the global economy, right? How do we like connect these, like how do we connect what they, because sometimes it's just delivering groceries, but how do we get what they do and make to the rest of the world? And I mean, to your point about getting people fresh food down the street, I mean, that is the dream we're all trying to get back to, right? That's so interesting.
Exactly.
We're almost out of time. What's one like in terms of like last notes, is there anything else you wish listeners of this podcast knew, that you really wish they would know about, Clint?
Well, I think we kind of shared the things I'm passionate about, in so far in this space. It's food, urban design, my family. I love hockey. That's kind of what I do and watch to kind of get by. I've learned a lot of my life to hockey too. But I think what I would leave people with is to start asking that question: how, if you have a problem in your community, if you have a frustration, how can aviation be a part of that? And I think that's
Mm,
something that the industry could have done itself a favor by asking in the beginning, because if you look back in 2016 and 17, all the discussion was around solving congestions.
mhm,
And you go to any city, they've been dealing with trying to solve congestion for decades. And they have well thought out plans. It's a mix of multimodal transportation. It's a mix of land use changes. I mean, there's a way to get over congestion. And then by coming in and saying, hey, we're just going to take all the cars off the road and put them in the air, well, it's probably a little bit short sighted. But listen to what the
mm,
problems are. What are
mm,
the issues? Carl is a great example, with Jump Arrow. All right, well, we may still be dealing with congestion, and one of the byproducts of congestion is I can't get emergency services. And so is there a way that aviation can get emergency services to communities better? When I was having some discussions in Los Angeles, there's a lot of discussion around how can advanced air mobility serve the Olympians and get spectators to events and support the
mhm,
Olympic venues and that kind of stuff. And there was some conversations between me and a colleague of, no, let's flip that. When 10 million people descend upon Los Angeles and congest all those roads, it's not just going to impact the venues and the athletes and the spectators. It's going to impact every single community member living in there. And what are those impacts going to be? How are they going to get their food? How are they going to get to work? How are they going to get emergency services when they need it? And how can aviation solve for that? And if we can solve for that, those solutions will be there even after the Olympics leave. And so now we've built in, laid a foundation that can be built upon that's going to last. It's not as sexy, it's not as exciting, but it's planting that seed that is going to grow.
I would argue that is actually a sexier way to think about it, Clint. I mean, what I'm really taking away is what you just said is when you look at problems within your community, ask yourself how aviation can be a part of solving it. Um, yeah, that's really powerful. Lastly, who else would be a phenomenal guest for the show? And I'm talking about cool technology. Who do you know that's on the cutting edge that you think would be a good guest?
Um, James Grimsley at the Choctaw Nation and the work that he's doing with the Choctaw Nation in, you know, making the Choctaw Nation a leader in the advanced air mobility space, making an indigenous community a leader in this space is super inspiring. And so he would be my number one pick.
Oh my gosh. Well, all right, we'll talk about that after the show is wrapped. Thank you for listening to Cool People, Cool Tech, Cool Stories. I'm Cameron Kitt from Yo-Yo's. Huge thanks to Clint Harper for joining us today and sharing his amazing story. You can check out the show notes for links to Harper 4D Solutions and, of course, Yo-Yo's website. And let us know what you think of this episode on social media using the hashtag CoolCoolCool podcast. Clint, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.